Hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rita Shelton Deverell, a theater and media artist. Dr. Deverell is co-founder of Vision TV, former news director at Aboriginal People's Television Network, and a member of the Order of Canada. In 2019, Dr. Deverell's book, American Refugees, Turning to Canada for Freedom, was published by University of Regina Press, and her play, Who You Calling Black, eh? Garnered 2 Ontario Arts Council Theatre Recommender grants. Dr. Deverell lives near the Aurelia campus, and in 2017 was awarded an honorary doctorate from Lakehead. In 2019, Dr. Deverell was appointed as an external adjunct professor. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Deverell, and we will be speaking about these topics of race, racism, and racialization in the context of education.
I think I'd better first tell you where I'm coming from. I was born in 1945 in the Houston, Texas Negro Hospital. So that means that I have been Black and female for 75 years. So you can locate that even more specifically. I went to the same high school as George Floyd, the man who was murdered in May of 2020. So that's where I'm coming from. When we come to terms like race, race is thought by many to be just a construct. It's something that we have layered on to society for a whole bunch of reasons. Since I grew up in the pre-civil rights US South, I have never had any doubts about being Black and everything that flows from that in terms of how I am treated. I don't spend a lot of time saying, does racism exist? I know it exists. So this is not a big question for me. So race may be a way that we think of people, just like gender, just like sexual orientation. Nonetheless, it's real in terms of how people are treated. Racism is a long-standing way of treating people that way. To give a really quick example, in the Atlantic region of Canada, where there is the oldest Black population, it is also the place where Black people have been historically most excluded. So that gets to be a pattern of racism for many years. Racialized, which is a recent term, I'm not sure what it means. I never use it myself. It seems to be used to mean people whose skin is some shade of dark and that they are perceived as having some shade of dark skin. So it's just simply not one of my terms. That doesn't mean it's a wrong term. The quickest thing to do with linguistics is to ask people how they wish to be referred to. That is, don't try. So I just told you, I'm Black. No big mystery. If you need to be more specific about that, I can become Afro-Canadian. And before that, I was an Afro-American. So that's me. My own view is that frequently we use discussion of terms to avoid the problem that we're talking about. Um, and there are right terms and wrong terms. I'm not denying that. Um, but whenever I am teaching a group of people, training a group of people, one of the things that I will say to them is, we are not going to spend half of our time talking about what to call people. We're going to spend our time uh, evolving our behaviors. I'll give you an example that I find absolutely shocking. I was introducing a visual artist who is Black, who is from Nova Scotia, at an art opening where one of her works, a huge visual arts installation, was being unveiled. And I introduced her to somebody else I know who has a doctoral degree, a white person. And I said, here is my friend so-and-so. The white person immediately says, why do you call yourself an Afro-Nova Scotian? Those terms are not used anymore in the States, as if that were important. Why don't you call yourself Black? My friend was, of course, quite shocked because the term Afro-Nova Scotian has a great deal of context in Nova Scotia. But I said at that moment, she determines what she is called. This is not your decision. So we're here to unveil her work of Afro-Nova Scotian art. That's what she has decided she is going to be called. So actually getting into those discussions, I think, is avoidance of talking about issues that arise from race, that arise from segregation, that arise from discrimination. We're avoiding talking about the problem by talking about terminology. You know, in preparation for having this conversation, I tried to think myself into my elementary school self and have a few memories of that. And I thought of two things that I think may be helpful. So I went to completely segregated schools. I'm in school in Houston, Texas. I graduated from high school in 1962. And although schools had been desegregated prior to 1962, Texas desegregated with all deliberate speed, as they called it, which meant very slowly. So all my elementary school, junior high school were in all Black schools with all of the teachers and the administration, meaning the principal and vice principals and so on. Everybody in the school was Black. So one of the things that happened in elementary school is that we would have field trips to the Houston Symphony, which is a very fine symphony orchestra then and now. Um, this took a huge amount of preparation for us, these field trips. Not only did we have to pay our fee and get on the bus, but we went through endless lessons of what we were to wear, how we were to behave, uh, when we were to applaud. Um, the background to the music would finally come out. And what I think we learned from these lessons is the way we were to start with was not good enough. Now, I'm not telling you this to say that it made me feel awful and I never wanted to go to the symphony again. In fact, that didn't happen at all. I developed a counter theme as a little kid, which is I decided that I was an artiste myself and I could wear rather eccentric clothes and I would define what I was supposed to look like. It was kind of a 7-year-old version of Black is Beautiful. But everybody didn't react that way. I think these lessons did teach some of us that the way we were was not good enough. So that's one thing I was remembering when I knew I was meeting with some elementary school teachers. A second incident, which is the good side of this, a remarkable teacher in our community. So when I was about 8, and I should tell you that my first profession, the first way I defined myself was as an actor. I decided I was going to be an actor quite early on in my life. This teacher, whose name was Vernell Lilly, directed a production of the Greek play Antigone in our local community center. The local community center, of course, was all Black. Everybody who attended the center, the staff, the audience, everybody was Black. So in Vernell Lilly's production of Antigone, everybody was Black. The result of this for me, and I was 8 years old and I remember it vividly, was that I didn't see any problem with Black actors playing any parts at all. This was a very early example of when you see yourself, you think you can do something. And I always believed that. Now, Saint Vernell Lilly just died very recently in her late 80s. I only kept up with her from a distance. She was a remarkable contributor. She finally taught in universities. She started theaters. And I met a fellow classmate of mine from elementary school just 5 years ago. We didn't recognize each other, of course. We looked differently from when we were in elementary school. Black guy, of course, everybody in the school was Black, who is a scientist. And what we got to talking about was he's never been interested in the arts. He's never been interested in theater. But Vernell Lilly was such a remarkable teacher that she cast him in a play and he was in the play just because he wanted to spend time with her. And he went on to say that what was remarkable about this, the play was in German because they had a German class. And so he's doing all these things that he's never done since. He feels foolish when he thinks about acting. But Vernell Lilly got all of these big guys who were not interested in any of this to be in this play. So teachers can have an absolutely remarkable effect. And her main effect was, you can do this. You don't need to change yourself to do these things that I am going to introduce you to. So you either learn, and elementary school is in fact home before elementary school, and elementary school is when you learn that you are good enough the way you are, the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, the timbre of your voice. If it waits until high school, it's already too late. You've already internalized lots of negative things about yourself or lots of positive things. The symphony example, what countered that for me was my parents. My parents absolutely brought me up to believe that I could do anything I was willing to work hard enough to achieve. So they contradicted this negative information that I was getting from the teachers about the symphony. On the other hand, they didn't need to contradict anything with Vernell Lilly. So parents also make a huge difference. But what I really want to flag is we are talking about very early ages when these messages are internalized. So if the students don't have parents like mine, what they find out in school becomes doubly important. And I said I grew up in the same neighborhood as George Floyd, which is true, but a huge difference is that we had different parents. My parents, who I had two parents, I'm one child, I'm an only child, two parents with decently paying jobs their whole careers, and were able to finance my education, which they thought was very important to do, to the end of a graduate degree. George Floyd had 5 siblings, one parent, was not able to get across the street to the Black University in Houston, which was literally across the street from public housing where he lived. And he was 40 years younger than I am, but this was not an opportunity that was available to him. So if parents are not able, for a whole variety of reasons, to say who you are is okay, who you are is good enough, whatever you are willing to work hard enough to do, you can get done, then it falls to the school. So it's a terribly important responsibility. On the other hand, one thing we have to be very careful about as teachers is not to punish people for not having the right parents. It's wonderful if you have parents who are advocates for the students, who have the resources to give them all kinds of extracurricular experiences. Many times I've talked about my mother, who, when everything was segregated and she wanted me to have particular kinds of experiences, she would have the institution. This happened with the Museum of Natural Science in Houston. So they had classes for young people, but these were classes for young white people. My mother convinced them that they were going to have a class for young Black students, so that I could be in the class. So here she was organizing whole groups of things so that I would have this experience. Now, she could have fought the battle, and she did, of segregation, and said, I'm not going to have this segregated class. But she did the best she could, because she knew she wasn't going to win that battle in time for me, because I needed the thing when I was 8 or 9 years old, or 10 or 11. And if it was going to take 10 years to fight the battle, well, then it would be too late. But you can't punish people for not having parents who are gifted. If they don't have gifted parents, then you have to become Vernell Lilly. One thing is, make no assumptions. We have no way of knowing what the other person's life experiences actually are. Race and racism does not affect everybody in the same way, just like gender doesn't affect everybody in the same way. We have to interact on the basis of being the most informative, inform-generating teachers that we can. And everybody is actually an individual. The other thing we need to know is that it's not a sin to feel more comfortable with people like you, whatever that is. What we can't make assumptions about is, what does people like you mean? For me, at this moment, the main thing that means is around age. It's significant to me when I talk to people who are in my age range, as opposed to people who are 25. This is a huge difference. So people like me, regardless of skin color, in part means age. And there are all kinds of other things that people like me means. So it's not a sin to feel more comfortable with people like you. Just don't make assumptions about that. What does get to be a problem is when we can only relate to people like us, when we can only invest time in people like us, when we can only promote people like us, when we can only see talent in people like us. An example that I use rather frequently, I've been on lots of hiring committees for a whole bunch of reasons, and I tend to think that women who wear long skirts are very elegant and appropriately dressed. That's because I wear long skirts. The problem is, I can keep feeling that way. I do feel that way. I can't stop feeling that way. when don't hire the person who's got 3 studs in their ears and wears a mini skirt or jeans. When I say this person isn't hireable as a professor of education, where did I get that from? So I don't have to feel differently. I have to know that that's how I feel and not not discriminate on the basis of long skirts. And that's what we have to do with the young people in our classrooms. It's not how we feel that's the problem. It's what we act on. So I should know that putting all the people of one color in the same seating pod is segregating the classroom. Why am I doing that? So being very aware of what our biases are, and biases are natural, they're human, and not acting on them is the main point. Yes, it is difficult. Here's one thing not to do. It's do not assume that anyone from a particular culture is an expert on that culture. Do not center that person out to say everything about being Chinese or being Black or being indigenous because they are only themselves. And they are 8 years old and they do not have the expertise on this. That's a different matter from you may have a lesson where everybody is supposed to bring in a story about their culture or some food from their culture or a saying of their grandparents or some older person. That can be done, but do not make someone an expert on their culture. That's one thing. Another thing is I am afraid that little children can be inherently rather cruel. And hopefully we as teachers are evolving little children to being less judgmental, less cruel, etc., as they get older. The other thing is to not jump to assumptions. I heard a wonderful lecture by a Black woman who was speaking at York University. And she said that her child, her Black child, said she wanted a white Barbie doll. And so the mother became irate. She would never have a white Barbie doll for her little girl. She made all kinds of lectures to the kid and finally discovered that the kid wanted the Barbie in a wedding dress, that was the Barbie that she wanted, and that's what she meant by a white Barbie doll. So we're dealing with rather young people who are moving along in their world. I think one of the best sorts of lessons we can teach is something I learned from my class at Lakehead University, which is rather than getting rid of Sir John A. Macdonald's name, teach lessons about Sir John A. Macdonald and find out the good things that he did and the bad things that he did, and be very clear about this, because students can understand this, and this is real. This is their history. So take real examples. Students can understand that Canada interred Japanese Canadians during World War II. They can understand that. They can learn about that. So if we take just our own history and our own present, and we deal with students in an age-appropriate way about our own history, I think we can, not with a view to saying this didn't happen and now we know better. There is the rush to say now we know better. We only know better when we can say, here's what was helpful, here's what was not helpful, if not downright dangerous and threatening about this particular era or these incidents. I guess I'm saying teach real lessons. And one other thing that we can do with young children is the guests we introduce them to are important. If we have some of those resources among parents of children in our classrooms, then that's very useful. I mean, a quite common thing, of course, is on Remembrance Day to call in veterans. Well, this is true with almost every aspect of life. If we can have an elder come into the class, we will learn a great deal about Indigenous peoples. If we can have an elder from our area, this person does live in your neighborhood, we will learn a lot more about Indigenous peoples. And this is true of other cultural groups. I heard this is back to the Japanese example. I heard a wonderful story on CBC radio where a medical doctor, a Japanese background, was getting an honorary degree from UBC, from University of British Columbia. And he was saying that this was very important to him because he had tried to attend the University of British Columbia before the war, and he was not admitted, and all the Japanese Canadians were sent from the West Coast to the interior of Canada. So what he did, the weekend he was getting his honorary doctorate, was to stay in residence. He said he was having all the experiences that he didn't get to have when he was a young man. And he was very jolly and very happy about this. But of course, his convocation speech was to tell students in graphic detail about what happened to him as a young man. But he was accepting that things have changed. And he described all of the how gracious the students were to him in his nights in residence and how much fun he had. So we're talking about somebody in his early 80s who was having a wonderful time in university residence. So the guest that you bring into your classes, especially people who live close, especially people who live close. I taught diversity journalism at Western. the University of Western Ontario, which has a graduate journalism program. And the first thing some of the students said to me in the class was, there is no diversity in London, Ontario. So I said, if you learn nothing else in this course, it will be to open your eyes and find out who is around you. What do you mean there's no diversity in London, Ontario? The biggest Indigenous story of this era happened a half hour from London, Ontario, which was the killing of Dudley George, which not a single journalism student had been sent to cover the hearings. I practically fell off my chair. London is a terminal of the Underground Railroad. So the students were brilliant. They learned their lesson. One who had decided to discuss, to make her major research project on Spanish-speaking people, discovered there were Spanish-speaking people in London from 14 different countries. And she was amazed. So there will be people. You don't have to live in Chinatown in downtown Toronto to find some people who can tell you and tell your class about important events in Chinese history and Canada's history and food and all kinds of things that you may want to know, holidays. So yeah, guests are a tremendous resource, and you can get very clever about finding them. I'm tempted to say keep it simple. Don't discuss terminology a lot. Ask people how they would like to be referred to. Yes, look for guests who are in your neighborhood who can be informative and fun. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about how you have biases. Worry about not acting on them. You just need to be aware of them and not act on them. And that every child has marvelous inner resources to be self-affirming when we affirm those resources, like my great teacher, Vernell Lilly. So good luck, and you can do this.
Thank you so much, Rita. We are all so much richer for this conversation.
Well, thank you. And I suppose we'd better get on to the rest of our lessons for today.